Good afternoon or morning, Cert 3 Community Services. Just doing a little bit more work on this knowledge assessment for the homelessness unit. I believe we're up to part 4. Service approaches quiz. Question 1 looks at how would you describe community delivered service provision? Choose 2 examples which describe this approach best, basically. So community delivered, if we're looking at what that is, and I guess we can think of some examples in the local area, services that are set up not by government organisations but essentially by community representatives or members that see a need. There's a really good example at Cardiff called Survivors Are Us, set up because there was a need to respond particularly to women and children leaving domestic and family violence and needing those resources and extra support, whether it be support like financial assistance, clothing, white goods. So they've got a big warehouse at Cardiff that has a lot of that sort of support. They do run an op shop, and I guess that helps generate revenue, and I guess they do some other services that I'm not sure on, but there are similar services out there just up the road. Our backyard does something similar, and I've spoken about that previously, but that is a community delivered response. So not relying on government funding. They may secure some from time to time, but generosity from benefactors, people who give to the service, volunteers, things like that, I guess is the primary way that service functions. And our backyard, just again, is for people who are homeless living in their car, but our backyard provides the kitchenette, bathroom, laundry, those sort of services. Orange Sky is another one, which I'll talk about later. In response, they do respond to homelessness. But they identify different ways that community can address and respond to homelessness, as I've just mentioned. So it could be food, emergency accommodation. So that food, Oz Harvest would be into that space, and they might advocate and be political and give a voice to people. So if we're looking at responses, I reckon B and C fall into what I've just spoken about. So we look at the next question 2 is asking what is holistic. What is a holistic service? So basically the idea of holistic is being that there are different parts of a person's life, but they're all connected to form the whole person. So when we say different parts, it could be their work life, relationships, physical health, mental health, and housing would be part of that. And that's all interconnected. So we're reviewing all of those different components when we're working with the person holistically. It's not just seeing aspects or parts of the whole experience of that person as one thing. It's interconnected. So D would fit into that best, I believe. Next one is client-centered. How would you describe a client-centered service for the persons who are homeless or at risk of homelessness? Which one? So what is client-centered? So basically it's about the work that we do being about the client. And, what does the client want? What are they telling us? We're having those conversations and those communications. What do they say that they need? Often I would see it, people are the experts of their experience. So we're looking at a client-led response and input from the client. Of course, we build up that trust and that rapport in our communication strategies as we go along, and that might take a little while depending on the circumstances, but we want that input from the client. And when in those interactions we do take into account difference, and whether it's a cultural difference or gender difference or some other cultural difference or diversity difference, but ultimately we're wanting to provide choice. So I believe B fits into that one best. B. Part 4, question 4, sorry. How would you describe the different models and approaches to services that empower or disempower? Choose true or false to demonstrate your knowledge. So we're looking at empowerment. So empowerment will enable people to have independence and confidence. So we're not about taking power away, stripping back and focusing on what they can't do. Giving that choice and that ability to use their strengths and participate is what we're after. So participation in everyday life and community activities, and we're working together. So if you look at A, B, C, D, I think you'd go false, true, true, false. So it's about that idea of people having value, feeling valued, and choice. Part 5, question 5. There are different values and philosophies which underpin the homelessness sector. There are different values and philosophies which underpin the homelessness sector and those who work within it. Match the description to the value and philosophy of the different aspects of the sector. Like, let's say, what do housing workers do? So they help assess and allocate and support people in their housing endeavours. So yeah, I guess it's a job title, a housing worker. So engagement linked to housing. So I guess what they're after there is, for example, a foyer approach, which I did do a bit more research on. I spoke about recently and gave an example of the Samaritans providing cheapish, accessible accommodation in an old school at Wickham. Young people commit to doing some study, and they do get some other wraparound supports, and it might be for a limited time, perhaps 2 years. So that youth foyer approach fits into that, where there's housing provided at accessible, affordable costs. We've got a lot of wraparound support, and young people make a commitment for perhaps for 2 years to study or get some other sort of qualification, I suppose you'd say, in broadly speaking, or maybe it's work experience, but they're doing something for that wraparound support and that cheap accommodation, a foyer approach. The next one I'm going to look at is that Congregate crisis care. Now, that's a funny word, congregate. I don't know if I've come across that until this question's previously, but it's Congregate. I guess they're looking at groups and looking at support for more than one person, I guess, and that fits really into that families escaping domestic and family violence. So I guess typically that would be a mother with some other children or dependents. So the accommodation approach would be ideally to keep those that family together. So it's a congregate crisis care. Structural approaches. So when we're talking about structures, and we'll look at those later in a bit more detail, but the systems that are in our world that contribute to homelessness. So some of those structures that are out there at the moment is the cost of housing, whether the private rental or the affordability to buy and purchase a house. There are other structures out there such as unemployment. So things that in society that really impact on people that we don't have a lot of direct control over. The employment rates, poverty, underemployment, casualisation. I guess, I don't know, COVID sort of exacerbated or makes a lot of those, it's actually more pronounced. So poverty and unemployment and casualisation has had a big impact. I guess there have been government responses with COVID payments and things like that to help alleviate, mass disaster, if you like. Although we are in a housing crisis without a doubt, and these structures that are around our experiences is something that I guess political pressure can put some pressure on governments to make changes in some way, shape or form that may alleviate some of those pressures. The last one, peer workers. So people who have had a lived experience, often in the mental health space, but it could be in the homelessness space. And then they go on to work and provide support in that area. So it could be homelessness, could be mental health, but it's called peer support or peer workers. We're up to we're up to Part 5, question 1, definitions. So primary, secondary and tertiary. So the primary homelessness is people sleeping rough, under bridges, etc., doing it real tough. Secondary is when people are moving from place to place, and the best example I can give is young people who might be couch surfing. I guess not necessarily always a young person, but you're there for a short time and then you move. So they could be on someone's couch for a week or a month and then you move on to the next person. The tertiary homelessness is described as that substandard housing, and I've spoken about those caravan parks that are, poorly maintained, if you like, perhaps with unsafe power points or poor amenities, shared communal showers, bathrooms, that sort of thing, similar to a boarding house. In the shared amenities, and perhaps how the feelings of, how safe those places are. They do serve a purpose, but not necessarily at a high standard, perhaps, in what they provide. Part 5, number 2, is we're going to a bit more detail in understanding structural issues that contribute to risk of homelessness. So we've got to understand these issues, and so we can be more effective in our responses. So it's true or false about some of those structural issues, which I just mentioned, but the cost of housing is a structural issue, and whether that's renting or home ownership. Renting in the private market is really totally unaffordable in most cases, unless you're earning a substantial income, really. So availability of affordable community or Department of Housing stock. So I guess that affordable housing, we'll call it. So places, whether it's the Department of Housing or community housing like Compass or Hume, the stock to meet demand. There's not enough stock to meet demand, to be in a simple snapshot. That's a structural issue in our society. We need to get a better structure, a better approach. Perhaps things like discrimination is an issue. Who makes a decision about who gets what? Are you locked out of employment based on your ethnicity or gender even? Domestic and family violence. Are women more prone to be exposed to the terrible impacts of domestic violence at the hands of men? Is that a structural issue in this day and age? Young people coming out of care of the state, kind of a structural issue, because the life opportunities can be quite challenging for young people coming out of care, as similarly for young people coming out of the jail and incarceration system, and what opportunities are opening. That's putting you at a severe disadvantage, to be honest, and that's a structural issue, as is poverty and being caught in a cycle of poverty. So they're all structural issues. There's the impacts for people experiencing homelessness. So things like having access to a shower or toilet, so that personal hygiene, that's definitely an impact. Access to nutritious food, if you're doing it tough, that's an impact. Mental health, and perhaps that leads to people self-medicating. That can lead to costs, or other, costs on freedom even, but self-medication, alcohol and other drug use, and cost. Access to medical and dental care can be tough. Trauma, mental health, before and after, experiencing homelessness. So it could be trauma that leads to mental health, or it could be a trauma that you take on as an experience of becoming homeless. So thinking about trauma before and after mental health, and then that idea of cumulative trauma, whether it's through domestic and family violence, the experience of being homeless, on the streets. So build up of trauma after trauma, if you like, and that does have impacts into a person's functioning without a doubt. So next, question 4, we're looking at the types of services in that homelessness space. So in that food and nutrition space, so we can give an example of somewhere like Oz Harvest out there rescuing good food and providing it at no cost to vulnerable people and vulnerable groups. So I used to participate in an organisation called Street Soccer, still into recent times, but supporting people who are on the margins, people at risk of homeless or are homeless, coming out of alcohol and other drug rehab, mental health support. A big contributor, there was a lot of wraparound services at this, it's a chance for people to get some fresh air and kick a ball around and network and have some human contact. Places like Oz Harvest were there, and they provided that free food that could last people for a few days. Orange Sky in that hygiene space, a portable shower laundry service, and also it's really about connecting again and sitting around on deck chairs and having a chat. But Orange Sky providing that hygiene support for people doing it tough on the margins, homeless or risk of homelessness. The public health service, you can access dental care. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a possibility. That looking at Duralong Lodge, I put it, or we help ourselves. So there, those spaces in that, so I'm talking about that. So Duralong Lodge, it's actually Duralong. I'll just call it Duralong. It's run by the Salvation Army, so it's a live-in detox type service, and it's around harm minimisation, strengths-based approach and support. We help ourselves, WHOS, whose, our Cessnock would be. Okay, so I've had a little technical glitch, guys. I'm just going to have a little voiceover here, and you get to look at the Wetlands Centre without my ugly mug, which might be a relief. But anyway, Where were we? We're up to the residential detox programs using harm minimisation approach. I spoke about Duralong run by the Salvos. We help ourselves. WHOS, they're out at Cessnock. Odyssey House in Sydney and other states and places. They're all about providing a harm minimisation but live-in approach. And you might know of some other services that fit into that space out there. I guess detox specifically would be in the health system as well, like hospitals, where you're really given medical support to come down and get off an addiction or addictive substance, and that could be quite a painful process in some way, shape or form. Services that use trauma-informed care approach. So we're looking at a lot of those family support type services, and they could be culturally specific. I'm thinking of perhaps Mullumbimba, working with the Aboriginal community, and intergenerational trauma is certainly an experience of many First Nations people working in those refuges and those refuge space where you are working and supporting people leaving domestic violence, for example, and in a state of trauma. Would be coming from that trauma-informed care, and in many cases people are working with cumulative trauma, so that's more than one trauma, and it could be, as I said, intergenerational trauma for some people as well. And there's a lot more training out there and knowledge to support people from that perspective and that approach. And the last one, mental health, case management, peer support type approach. So we've spoken about peer support, where you might have had a lived experience, or someone working in that peer support role is coming from that lived experience, perhaps in homelessness, or it could be mental health or some other lived experience, and they're working in that space. And perhaps, a lot of those services would have that case management approach. So in that crisis housing accommodation space, for example, case management, to try and pull all the services together and have a coordinated approach would be seen as most appropriate and effective to try and help people move forward to a better life opportunity. Okay, so we must be up to 5. Number 5, we're looking at how do outreach services support pathways out of homelessness. Choose 2 responses that describe this process. So I'll just give a little example of some outreach services. One comes to mind is the Family Action Centre. They're based at the Uni of Newcastle, and they had or may still have, the Caravan Project. It may have changed names, but essentially it was supporting people living in caravan parks. And as we've spoken about, they can be people vulnerable to, being unsafe in just the environment, or perhaps other predatory type behaviour, perhaps from other people at caravan parks, communal baths and showers, etc. Young people and children needing extra support if they're living in that environment. So that was the role of the Family Action Centre, and they're outreaching and going into that space. Another term that you might come across in the homelessness sector is assertive outreach. So that's going out onto the street and making connections, working with people who are rough sleeping, whether it's on the streets of Sydney or Newcastle or under bridges in country areas, making connections, getting to know them, advocating on behalf of them in some cases, or with them for that extra support. And I guess the language I can look at C there is providing a rapid pathway to service access quickly and advocate on behalf of clients. So that would be something that assertive outreach worker would do, as it would be establish connections with people who may be disconnected from services and supports. So it is getting out there and being proactive in making those connections. That takes us to the end of part 5. The next one is part 6, but I'm going to leave it at part 5 for now, so I'm going to say toodle pips.